Hello and welcome to the New York Jewish Film Festival. I'm Aviva Weintraub, director of the festival from the Jewish Museum. We co-present the festival with Film at Lincoln Center every year in January. And I'm really thrilled and delighted that we're presenting a special revival film this year called Kaddish by director Steve Brand. The film originally came out in 1984 and has been restored. And I'm delighted that to speak with me today, I have the filmmaker, Steve Brand, as well as the subject of the film, Yossi Klein Halevi, who is senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Welcome, Steve and Yossi.
Thank you.
Hi, nice to see you.
So the film is so interesting on so many levels. And I was particularly struck at what a time capsule it is of New York City, of the Jewish community in New York or communities in terms of the concerns that people had at that time. And it's so interesting to revisit them all these years later. Steve, what inspired you to bring the film back out and do this restoration?
Well, Yossi and I have been talking about bringing it back for some time. The film was basically out of circulation. There wasn't even really a DVD other than kind of a fairly amateurish version that I had made from the VHS that my distributor had been marketing. And unfortunately, my distributor had lost the original negative. And not only that, they also had lost the interpositive that was made from the original negative. So there were no original master materials. And I was afraid, that the film was going to be lost. And so we applied for some grants, and we got a grant from the Memorial Foundation for Jewish Culture that got us started. Thank you very much, Memorial Foundation. And we were able to restore it from right in your neighborhood, right next door practically, at the library for the performing arts at Lincoln Center. The New York Public Library had a pristine print of the film, which they were kind enough to loan us so that we could use that as it had a couple of imperfections, but I had about 11 other prints lying around that had been heavily used, kind of scratched and all that. But we were able to, the parts that didn't work so well in the Lincoln Center print, we were able to use other prints. So we scanned them all. And I went to Indie Collect, which is a nonprofit that restores films on the verge of being lost. And they did the restoration. They did a wonderful job.
That's fantastic. And what was it like to live again with all of the footage, with the film itself? Because I'm sure it was a very, very labor-intensive and time-consuming process.
Well, I'll tell you, I'll just share an anecdote that when I went to Lincoln Center to screen the film, they also had some of the original press photos for the film. I had to put on these gloves to look at these archival materials that I had given them. These photographs and stuff to go through. But it was, it was kind of a trip down memory lane over and over again, because it took quite a while to do the restoration. We had to resync it up. Fortunately, I had the original 35 millimeter mix of the film, which is actually better sound than was in the original print, because that's an optical track. This is magnetic sound, which is better quality. So it sounds better than it did in the theaters. Hopefully it will back then. And it was just amazing to go through it. And one of the major things that we had to do was what I called schmutz removal, because there was dirt on the prints. Even though we cleaned it, there was dirt in all sorts of places, little hairs and stuff. And we had to individually remove all these little hairs and things in the film and crazy things. And that, took quite a while. And I also went back, and some of the original interviews were done on 3/4 inch tape when we first started. And that's all we had to to work with, including major interviews with Yossi and with his father. And we went back to, I still had the original 3/4-inch tapes. And so rather than use the Kinney version of them, that we did way back then, we went back to the original and digitized that and put that into the film. So it's better quality as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it was quite a process.
And Yossi, had you seen the film since the 80s?
It's a really good question. I hadn't seen it for many years. I had a very ambivalent relationship with the film for at least two reasons. One is because I moved to Israel right around the time that Steve finished the film, and my life changed so drastically that I felt disconnected from the material in the film. The other reason that I felt strange about the film was, I think, for very understandable reasons, it's an awkward experience to look at yourself when you're a teenager or in your early 20s. It's a period that is probably best not to record for perpetuity, but there it is, and it took me many years to relax and I won't say enjoy the film, but to own it, and showing it to my kids really helped. I made a point of showing it to all three of my kids before their bar bat mitzvah, that I was part of the experience, and the reactions were very mixed. My daughter sat there, watched about 20 minutes, and said to me, "Have I seen enough yet?" And I said, and my answer was, "Well, I suppose you have." so we ended it there. She has seen it since. This was quite a while ago, at least 20 years ago. So I feel incredibly grateful to Steve to have given my children this gift of their grandfather, who they never knew. And that's really, really precious. And if they have to live with the awkwardness of seeing their father at their age, then that's I think a small price to pay.
My son saw it.
Oh, sure.
My son saw it my older son saw it for the first time when he was 13 in Berlin. It was at the Berlin Berlin Jewish Film Festival, and I took him with me, and he fell asleep. He fell asleep in the theater. And he saw it many years later at MoMA, and he's seen it since, and he seems to appreciate it. But I think he managed to stay awake through the whole thing the second time.
What was the response when you first released the film? I think it premiered at the New Directors New Films Festival in 1984.
Yes, right, in April. And there were two screens. And unfortunately, Yossi was in Israel. He couldn't be there, but his mother was there, which was wonderful. And she became a kind of a celebrity in certain circles.
She loved it, Steve.
Yeah, she was fantastic. I mean, I just have to say, Yossi's family was just fantastic in welcoming me and my crew into their house, into their lives, into their innermost thoughts over 5 years. Not everybody will do that, and there was a lot of warmth in that family that I hopefully captured some of in the film.
And when you started out to make the film originally, you say it was a 5-year or so process, and I think there's quite a lot of footage from the late 70s in the film. What did you have in mind? Is the finished product what you set out to make, or did your idea of it change over time?
Well, it changed over. Originally, it started out for me as a two-page proposal that I brought to a conference on Jewish films at the Martin Steinberg Center of the American Jewish Congress back in '76, I guess. And
Wow.
it was a film about survivors who had come to New York. It was a question about Jewish resilience. How do Jews manage through the lens of the Holocaust experience to overcome these unbelievable calamities through the millennia, reestablish themselves, go on, and not only go on, but continue as Jews? You know, it's rather remarkable. And, you know, I come from a refugee family from Austria. And so I was interested in actually looking at Jews who've settled in New York City and how they made the transition, et cetera. And Yossi was at the conference and he had a proposal of his own. I think it was also 2 pages. And we seemed to be the only ones at the conference who were interested in each other's proposals. There was someone there from one of the major organizations, Jewish organizations, who had no interest whatsoever in documentaries. They were only interested in doing trigger films for specific causes that they were raising money for. So Yossi and I decided to work together. His project, I mean, Yossi, maybe you can, if you remember, I don't know what
I don't remember what the proposal was, but I do remember that initially we conceived of a film that would trace the Holocaust through 3 families. We would begin with your family, and that would tell the story of the German, Austrian Jewish experience. We would then move to a Polish family, and I was there with a friend of mine, Bob Rosenberg, whose background is his father was a survivor from Poland. And then we would end the film with my family, Hungarian Jews. And so the film would progress. It would tell the story of the Shoah as it chronologically unfolded through these 3 families. And fortunately, the other 2 families were camera shy, and they said, start with someone else. And my father had been waiting for really since the war for someone to show up with a camera and interview him. So when Steve showed up, you know, my family was just thrilled. So when Steve talks about being warmly accepted, you know, from my father's point of view, this was, you know, where have you been all my life? And fortunately, I say we started with my father because about a year into the filming, he got a heart attack and died. And so suddenly, I'm speaking now not as my father's son, but as from an artistic point of view, we had a really interesting film, and we realized that this needs to be the subject of the film: the death of a survivor and how a family contends with the aftermath. And it's interesting because when we started this project, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, but I don't think there were any films yet on children of survivors. We were, from our point of view, I think we were the first. I'm not sure that we were the first by the time the film came out. It took us longer than we thought it would take. It took us time to raise the money. But certainly this was really one of the very first in the genre.
Well, it was. This was all sort of in the time when Roots came out on television and became the sensation. And Helen Epstein's book on children of survivors, Children of the Holocaust, I think it was called, came out. So all of a sudden there was this, and we were like already talking about this at the same time. And actually, Yossi, what you were talking about was actually the second stage of what we were doing, because initially we were going to do this film about the Holocaust And we spent months meeting and arguing, the three of us. It was originally the three of us were going to make this film, you and Bob Rosenberg and myself. And we were just arguing about what's the film going to be? What's it going to be bad?
Right.
What are we
Right.
focus? And then we discovered that the BBC had done this 4-part miniseries on the final solution. And it's like they kind of stole our thunder. You know, it's like, I guess we're not going to do that. Mm-hmm. And we had the opportunity to apply for a youth grant at NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities. And we said, well, what can we tell them we can do that for $10,000, which is how much was available. And we decided, well, let's tell them we're going to do a film about our 3 families. And we got the grant. It was the first grant we applied for. And he said, hey, you know, this actually is not a bad idea. Maybe we should actually do this. Because we had a Hungarian family hiding, we had a camp survivor family. We had the assimilated Jews from Austria who were refugees who escaped out to Kristallnacht. So it seemed pretty compelling. I had not even mentioned it to my parents that we had written a proposal that they were in. And then Bob's family decided they didn't want to participate. And then it was actually 6 months after we started filming with Yossi and his father, and still looking for other families to replace, Bob's family. 6 months later, Yossi's father passed away. And it, dawned on me that this is the film. This is going to be the film. We don't need other families. Let's do like the microcosm and see how, that can resonate to other families, other experiences. And I think not only to Jews and Jewish Holocaust survivors, I think there are a lot of cultures, a lot of families that can identify with this experience, unfortunately, from different parts of the world and different experiences.
Yeah, I think it's worth really restating that this was a rare documentary film at the time. Since 1984, there have been hundreds, if not more, documentary films about the Shoah, about the effects on subsequent family members and generations. And it must have been, literally groundbreaking. But what was the public response to the film? Or if you remember the critical response, were people saying this is a new genre that is, worthy of exploration?
Well, there were actually 3 films coming out at the same time, including ours, really within months of each other, on children of survivors.
Wow.
The others were kind of looking at many different families. This was the only one that focused on one family, and from a very personal experience all the way through. And they were actually all reviewed together in Hadassah magazine. I remember at one time, but the response to this film was very gratifying. The reviews were astonishingly positive, except for the New York Times, which basically described the film, but that didn't really offer much in the way of commentary. But, other, David Denby, David Edelstein, many reviewers around the country had really, plaudits. David Edelstein described Yossi as a Moses who's seen too much, and it was made the Edelstein's 10 best list in the Village Voice for the 1985 films. And it won a documentary award in Sundance. It got wonderful reviews around the country, and it played theatrically and at festivals around the world. It didn't make any money, but it got wonderful reviews. And it aired on public television back in New York only in 1987, and on Bravo. And And it was at many major film festivals. It was at the first Moscow Jewish Film Festival and the first Berlin Jewish Film Festival. I'll just to tell you a story about Moscow, because as you know, Yossi was a Soviet Jewry activist. Showing the film in Moscow in, I think it was 91, 92, something like that, was an extraordinary experience because there are all these Soviet Jews in the audience and they're watching the story of these activists coming into the Soviet immigration office and trying to take it over and being beaten up by the KGB and having a sit-in outside the immigration office in Moscow. People just applauded it. They were ecstatic. It was amazing. It was an amazing, chilling. I wish you could have been there, Yossi. It was just an extraordinary experience to show it there.
Yeah, I think it is. That is one of the very interesting parts of the film, looking at the history of the Free Soviet Jewry movement, which was huge here at the time. Yossi, what do you remember about your involvement from those times?
Well, what I remember is actually what was left out of the film, which is that I gravitated to the Jewish Defense League, to the JDL, because I felt that the mainstream Soviet Jewry movement was too timid. This was around 1971. I was 17 when I started going to JDL demonstrations. And the sit-in in Moscow was actually a JDL event. And when the film came out, I was surprised that JDL wasn't mentioned. And I just assumed that Steve wanted to downplay the let's say the more seamy side of my activist story. And then just recently, Steve said to me, you know, I had no idea you were in the JDL. Why didn't you tell me? And so I you know, this was really crossed signals. I wish that I had told him, because it was a very important part of where this story unfolded. You know, in a way, what this film is about is this young person's struggle to unpack this load that his father put on him. And so the JDL and Jewish extremism was really an important part of trying to deal with that. And I remember when the film came out, I felt that part of my story, which for me was really so seminal, and for reasons that I did not understand then, had been excluded from the film. I felt the need to tell that story, and so I ended up writing my first book, which really revisits the material in Kaddish, but from a very different perspective. And it's called Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, and it really focuses on the development of a young extremist sensibility.
And I'll just tell you, you know, and when I read the book, which was a wonderful book, that's when I learned that Yossi had been in JDL. And I said, why didn't he tell me? He never told me. I would have put it in the film. And I didn't, you know, back then you couldn't Google somebody and find out, oh, JDL, look at all the photos, blah, blah, blah. And he never mentioned it to me. And he did tell me about throwing bags of blood at the Ukrainian ballet, but he didn't say it was a JDL.
Let's be more specific, Steve. Okay. It was at Lincoln Center.
Oh my God!
It was at the Metropolitan Opera House, and the Ukrainian dance company in summer 1972.
Yeah,
so
seemed a little extreme for student struggle for Soviet Jewry, but I didn't make the connection back then. I guess I just hadn't done my research, and so I didn't find out till later. And I just felt he didn't want me to know because he didn't want that in the film. So there you go. Took us almost 40 years to realize that we had miscommunicated on that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh gosh. I felt like in the film there was an interesting line being drawn between the Soviet Jewry movement and people's sort of awakening pro-Israel feelings. And there was, in particular, a conversation, Yossi, with your parents. I wonder if you could just, because I think the concerns, let's say, of the American Jewish communities at the time were different from now, because the world, the country is different and the world is so different. Can you situate a little bit what that pro-Israel feeling meant at the time, if that question makes sense?
Yeah, very much so. The Soviet Jewry movement coincided, or let's say the awakening of Jewish consciousness in the Soviet Union coincided with the Six-Day War. It was really the war that inspired young Soviet Jews to begin that very heroic process of reclaiming their Jewish identity and of actively opposing the Soviet government. And that had, in turn, a very powerful impact on the generation of American Jews that were coming of age in the 1960s. And so what you really see in that film is a convergence of the Soviet Jewry moment, the post-1967 enthusiasm for Israel, and the American 60s, which is really hovering in the background of the film, and had a formative impact on certainly on Jewish activism. You know, we saw ourselves as being the Jewish analog to what was happening in the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. There was very much of it. So we were getting, we were drawing inspiration simultaneously from Israel, from the Soviet Union, and from the American 60s, and it all converged at that moment.
You know, just to add to that, what we're putting out at the DVD and Blu-ray and digital downloads with the film, and there'll be bonus features, including a 30-year later interview with Yossi and an interview with me, and deleted scenes. And one of the deleted scenes is called America in the 60s. And it's basically about Yossi's and his father's slightly different viewpoints on America in the 60s and what it meant. And how, you know, for Yossi's generation, it was exciting. It was, you know, and for his dad, it was these kids don't know what they're doing.
Oh, worse than that, Steve. It was the decline. It was the decline and fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, yeah. So that's all there. Very interesting. There's a quintessential moment when Zoltan recalls being in the Klein's confectionery truck with Yossi making deliveries in Manhattan. And there was a demonstration for Biafra. And Yossi wanted to get out of the van and join the demonstration. And his father said, you remembered? Yes. He said,
I don't remember the exact words, but certainly the sensibility was nobody cares about us and you should only demonstrate for Jews. You shouldn't have anything to do with anyone else, you know.
He didn't say that. He said, look, these are poor people and they have a valid cause, but we have our own family. We have, you know, there are Jews all over the place. If you want to go and demonstrate for a Jewish cause. So it was a little softer than you just put out, at least in his version of
it. You talked about the 60s, the scene a little bit just now. There's a fascinating scene in the film where I guess there was a fascination with the punk scene and a kind of confluence of Hasidic post-apocalyptic. Can you talk a little bit about that nugget?
Yeah, I was living in the East Village at the time. This was just before I moved to Israel, 1982, and it was the punk scene was still fairly vibrant at that time, and I was fascinated by this apocalyptic outbreak, and I felt that this sort of private Jewish apocalyptic fantasy that I'd nurtured growing up had suddenly become part of the consciousness of the whole generation, and this was really interesting to me, and so I wrote an article about going back and forth between the Hasidic communities in Borough Park, which were survivor communities in those years, and these apocalyptic gatherings, the concerts, the bars in the East Village, and it was really about living with the consciousness of endings, beginnings, and you know, it's interesting that I think for you, Steve, the film really is about apocalyptic consciousness, which of course is so widespread today, and it's an interesting coincidence that we've released this film at a time when the world feels so apocalyptic, and I don't sound quite as much of a raving lunatic in the film as I did when it was made, and that really troubles me, because I don't own that sensibility anymore. I'm very happy in my life. I really don't want the apocalypse to come in any form, and the notion that these apocalyptic fantasies that were so much a part of who I was growing up is now in some sense mainstream, really worries me.
Well, there's a lot to be apocalyptic about. I mean, one of the lines in the film, I remember you were saying, talking about the 1980s. I don't know if it's going to be fascism from the right, fascism from the left. You can pick your paranoid fantasies, but I think we're on the verge of something unhealthy. That was back in 81 or so, you said that. And now it's like you can pick your apocalypse. Is it going to be the environment? Is it going to be a plague? Is it going to be, refugee upsurges, displacements, sometimes based on climate change? There are all sorts of apocalypses to choose from. And what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting to me in knowing you over the years is that when we made the film, your focus to me seemed to be very much based on what had happened in the past, the residue of history and its impact on today, and the fear that it's all going to happen again. And now you seem, maybe having 3 children has something to do with it, much more focused on the future, not obsessed with the apocalypse is coming. And I think it's also very much part of having moved to Israel. So I think now you're much more future oriented. Back then, the past seemed to control much of your thinking through your father's imprecations.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's right. And I think living in Israel really gives you an appreciation of the need not to live in a mindset of threat, because we live with threat as part of our daily reality. And the way that Israelis cope, and I think part of my becoming an Israeli in a fuller sense, was learning the Israeli skill set of the pretense of normal life, that, you know, you could have a suicide bombing at a bus stop, and a few hours later, the cleaning crew has already wiped away any indication of disaster, and people are just standing there waiting for the next bus. And that's really how Israelis cope. And so when I listen to the hysterical teenage apocalyptic voice in the film, it's so antithetical to the Israeli mindset that that it's you know, aside from the process of growing up and having more at stake in a normal and stable life, it's also really changing cultures. And that's, I think, had a very big impact on how I relate to the film, and why it was so difficult for me all these years to fully own it.
I think a lot of the film was also, your grieving process with your dad. I mean, in a very public way.
Right.
And I think some of the, apocalyptic feelings that you had as you resumed your life and went back into journalism after running the candy business for over a year, was this loss, and really of this major part of your life, and just coping with that and dealing with that and trying to put everything together again. I
think you're right. You know, the hardest moments for me in the film is watching me trying to be honest about my grief, but doing it publicly and not being able to really be honest. And it was so dissonant and frankly, such a bizarre experience that took me, I think, many years to get over, and to really be able to mourn in a private way.
Thank you. I think what you've been articulating these past few minutes really speaks to why one of the reasons the film is so compelling to watch today. So I'm really pleased that people will have a chance to see it again. Can you each tell us a little bit about what you're working on now, or what your future projects might be? Steve?
Sure. Well, I've been working for some time now on another documentary. This is a biography, the life, thought, and impact of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who I'm sure many of the people watching this will know about, but those who don't. He was a theologian. He taught at the Jewish Theological Seminary for many, many years, died in 1972. And he was also a major social justice, human rights activist. He was involved in the civil rights movement, the Soviet Jewry movement, the Second Vatican Council. He wrote a book about Israel after the Six-Day War. A very outspoken, kind of prophetic individual. Is one of his books on the prophets was very influential in the civil rights movement. And it, to me, in certain ways, this is a sort of a sequel, for me, at least emotionally, philosophically, from Kaddish, in that Kaddish poses the question, by the end of the film, you come from this view of life as one of victimhood to one of survival. And now the question is posed, survive for what? And we address that somewhat in Kaddish. Yossi talks about that. But this is, and Heschel's life was all about survive for what? As a Jew, survive for what? What does it mean to be Jewish in the fullest sense? And so for me, it also addresses the question of, where was God during the Holocaust, that we touch on in Kaddish, but it gets explored much further in this film. So that's what
Well,
I'm looking.
Viva, it's an interesting question for me because I'm actually going back to this material for the first time in probably 40 years. And I'm writing a book about the wisdom of Jewish survival. And
Oh,
it asks the question, the starting question of the book is, how did we move from the lowest point in Jewish history, which was 1945, to what I would argue is the peak moment in Jewish history, which is today. We've never been more powerful. We've never had the world's attention to the extent we have now. We've never been more center stage. Our story has never been of greater interest to the world, in good ways and less good ways. But there's clearly a focus, even an obsession, on our story. And so I'm trying to understand how American Jewry and Israel together saved the Jewish people. And it's not so much a history lesson as it is looking at the transition from the 20th to the 21st century. And what is it that the Jewish people in the 21st century need to carry from the 20th century? What do we need now that will help us navigate the much more complicated, morally complicated world that the Jewish people lives in today? And you alluded to that in your question about Israel. You know, for our generation, we were 20, 30 years after the Shoah. Israel was fighting existential conflicts. Soviet Jewry was fighting to be free. All of those were really black and white struggles. It was good versus evil. And it's no longer so clear in Jewish life. So what is it that's useful from that period for us and what's not useful? So I'm trying to, in a way, sum up, and it's a very personal book. I'm going back to my father, and I haven't written about my father really in 40 years. And so I'm trying to do this now. I'm almost 70, and it's a kind of a retrospective, both personally and it's a generational story as well.
well, both those projects sound amazing, and I look forward to learning more about them as they evolve. I want to wrap up now and thank you both so very much for the film and for taking the time to speak with me today.
Well, Aviva, thank you for the opportunity, first of all, to speak about Kaddish with Steve. This is something that's taken us way too long to do, and I'm just really thrilled that we're able to do it. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Aviva. And hopefully we'll get to chat about this a little more. I think the last time we were together talking about Kaddish perhaps was when it screened in Israel in like 1985 or something like that. So it's been quite some time.
Wow.
Long road traveled. Thank you
Nice.
so much, Aviva.
Thank you.